I kind of wanted to highlight an interesting thought experiment. Not really thought experiment, but just a interesting idea I had. So I wanted to talk about race, ethnicity, nationality, just what would I call it? How people see each other. So on one level, race is a entirely unscientific idea. We know this from genetic studies, right? We know this. There's more differences within quote unquote racial groups, right, than between racial groups, right? Now, so if you take, for example, to white people, to black people, to Asian people, right, etc., right, to Hispanic people, there's more differences within a group, right, to white people than between a white person and a black person, right? On average, right? And that is the law of averages, but it just means that there's no there's no genetic basis for it. Of course, genetics is only one component of being human, right? There's epigenetics, there's MHC, there's gut microbiome, right, et cetera, right? There's so many things we can talk about, but at least genetically speaking, race is a non-scientific idea. Now, but I do want to talk then about the second level, which is, but then why do we think of people in terms of race, right? Because obviously people have different skin colors, right? Yes, we all have different skin colors. Obviously we do, right? And yes, we have obviously different, features, right? Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are skinny, right? Yeah, we're all different, of course, right? So in that sort of general sense, we can start to see why we created the concept of race, right? But it still doesn't have. So we can see both the human way in which we categorize people, right? Oh, that's a black person, that's a white person, right? That's an Asian person, right? We can see kind of how we come to how we come to categorize it, right? But at the very same moment, to also recognize that there's no scientific basis behind it, right? But just because it's not genetically true, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on our lives. So race, ethnicity, nationality still impacts our lives, right? How we like perceive each other. Um, just like money. Money is something we use in everyday modern life, right? For a modern life, it's a necessity. Even though money, all of us know it, right? It's totally made up, right? We made it up, right? It's the same as monopoly money, right? We all just agreed that it has value. Of course, there's a whole long, complicated history behind it. But even though money is made up, it has an enormous impact on our lives. Same with race. Even though it's totally made up, it has a huge impact on our lives. And it's interesting. So I guess just to make a distinction, race is more of the nature aspect, right? It's like how you were born, where you can't change it, right? Whereas ethnicity is the culture, right? It's how you were raised, which can be changed, right? Versus nurture, nature versus nurture. At least putting it very simply, right? And nationality, of course, is about nation states, which is also a very recent concept. Before nation states, we didn't have a nationality, we had ethnicity. And before race, right, before race theory or races, right, we didn't really have a concept of race. Yes, we still like for example, with nations, we still had people who had different cultures, right, who looked different, right, who had different skin colors to us, right? But we didn't have that notion, the idea of race, right? It's kind of like when it's like if you had a caveman look at a smartphone, right? And you ask them to describe it, right? They would say like, if they used English, right, they would say like, oh, it's square, it's kind of smooth, it's like kind of clear, but there's light flickering, right? But they would have no concept, no idea of a phone, right? They can describe it, right? It's like, oh, it's like this, right? But they don't have even the notion of a phone, right? It's the same with race, right? Before we had the idea of race, it's like, oh, that person looks a little different, right? Oh, they have a little bit of a different skin color, right? But there's no idea, there's no concept of race, right? It doesn't exist. So it's very interesting how, how it kind of the general progression, right? I'm not talking very historically. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scientist. Um, but just very generally, speaking very generally, the so first we had the idea of ethnicity, right? People acting differently, and then we had the idea of, oh, that person looks a little different from me, right? Or those people look different from these people, and then it became the idea of race, right? But there's no scientific basis behind it, at least genetically speaking. However, it still has an impact on our lives, just like money. Similarly with money, right? At first, it probably was like kind of like an IOU or debt type of system. Maybe not even debt, but just like social obligation. But then over time, it became more and more formal, right? With accounting, with mathematics. And math actually probably came before writing. Yeah, actually math came before writing, which is very interesting. So and then we had things like gold lending, gold changing, and then we had paper money, and then we had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's it's not, no, I'm making it seem like it's a linear progression. It's not, right? But just to give like a general sense of how things happened, it's really interesting that even though money, it's not a scientific, it's not based on anything really. Right? It's fiat currency. It's not tied to anything. Race, it's not tied to anything, right? Time is also not tied to anything at all, right? Really, we feel like we have time, but linear time was not a concept that existed at all, right? Most cultures before perhaps the Enlightenment thought in cyclical time, right? Like the seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter, or day and night, right? Most cultures think cyclically. So all these ideas we kind of take for granted now. Um, the ego, right? That's another one, right? We didn't really even have the concept of the ego until we started thinking of us as individual agents, right? Like basically individuality, right? Or the idea of free will. That wasn't really even a thing, um, because we're all interconnected together because humans are social creatures, right? We can't live without each other. Or ideas like about nature, right? Nature was not even a concept till probably the ancient Greeks invented that concept, right? Separated mankind from nature, right? Because before that, nature and mankind were the same thing, right? There was no separation. We are nature. Right, so it's interesting, like this evolution, branching of ideas or just notions or concepts. The whole reason why I went into this is to basically to question everything, right? Things we take for granted, but are they actually really founded upon solid principles, right? Or are they just perhaps imaginary? They still money, time, private property, ego, race, all these concepts, they're still very prevalent, right? They're still very important to our daily lives, yes. But are they really grounded in quote unquote reality, right? Because the most important things we have as human beings is our story, right? Our the way we make meaning. But the way we really make meaning is relationships, right? How we relate to these stories. Stories about ego, time, money, and really stories about how we connect to each other. Because our meaning comes from each other. My meaning is you, and your meaning is me.